Okay, so we're going through objections to Pascal's wager, and we finished a bunch of ones in chapter 3, which I thought were seriously worth consideration. And then we went over the many gods objection, which I think has been the biggest objection to Pascal's wager throughout the centuries. Hume gave it. I think Antony Flew gave it. Many have given it. Atheist philosophers against atheist or agnostic philosophers against Pascal's wager. This next set of objections, actually, they're not taken that seriously. So, but Rhoda still spent some time on it, so we'll go over them. The first one is pretty quick. Somebody asks, "Is the wager unchristian? Doesn't it seem self-interested? Shouldn't we love God for God's own sake?" And it's on pages 69 to 70. And as I could tell, he already dealt with this in the previous chapter. So I thought maybe he was just pushing it just to be extra sure that the reader gets it. And he even cites another passage. Last time he cited the passage of the prodigal son. This time he cites this passage where Jesus actually says, you might lose a lot in this world, but you'll gain a lot in the next world. That's toward the bottom of page 69. So that's the response to that question, whether the wager is unchristian. And he says, no, nothing bad about it. All right, so that one was a little bit less interesting philosophically. So this next wager, this next objection, it's a little less interesting as a serious objection to Pascal's wager, but I think it's worth exploring just because we get to learn some philosophy while doing it. Rhoda has a bunch to say on page 70 and 71 about the Christian tradition, part of which is this, and I think the most important parts is going to come on page 72. On page 72, he distinguishes two propositions called Proposition 6 and Proposition 7. I wrote them ahead of time because my handwriting is better if I write it ahead of time. So a human being's salvation depends in part on how that human being responds to God's assistance. That's Proposition 6. Proposition 7, human beings cannot do anything good without God's grace. Okay, so think about those two. In the Christian tradition, you have, human beings are fallen as sinners. So apart from God, and this is what he supports in the previous pages, and you should give those a read. But apart from God, we don't do anything good, and that's because we're fallen in our sin. But on the other hand, it's supposed to be that our salvation is partly dependent on us and our human freedom, right? But then seems like that would be us doing something good, right? So how can it be that apart from God, we can't do anything good? Okay, that's going to be your Proposition 8, right? Human beings can't do anything without grace, God's goodness to us. But on the other hand, a human being's salvation depends partly on us and our free will. It seems like there's a conflict between saying everything's due to God's grace, and we're not the ones doing the good work. But on the other hand, it's still partly up to us whether we're saved. Okay, so that's supposed to be the conflict. Now here's Rhoda's reply. Okay, so you guys get what the problem is supposed to be. See, now I could check whether you guys are nodding, and you could raise your hand, and I could call on you, but we'll have to keep pushing on. So Rhoda draws from the philosopher Thomas Aquinas, not surprisingly, and he says, well, we gotta explore some different options here, okay? We could be willing to do the good and for good, okay? And we could try to be willing for the bad and doing bad, or we could just omit to will. So that's the next distinction Rhoda gives. Normally we think we're either willing or we're unwilling, okay? But there's also the option of willing for or willing against or just not willing anything. And he uses an example from Eleanor Stump. Okay, so we're pushing on in the handout. He talks about three, I'm looking at the handout now, you can look at the handout. There's three positions with respect to our willing. What are they? Willing for, willing against, and omitting, like I showed you. And then Rhoda uses an analogy drawing from the work of Eleanor Stump, pages 72 to 73. On the handout, what is it? Does it help show that 6 and 7 are not in conflict? So what's Stump thinking about? Stump's thinking about a person, okay? And the person might be walking east, okay? Or they might be walking west, or they just don't move either way, okay? Now, walking east, I would say, is kind of like doing the good, and like willing for God. And then west could be like doing bad or willing against God. But we can still choose to just refrain from doing the bad. Okay, that says bad. Okay, in this way, it is still partly up to us. Okay, a human being's salvation depends on part on us and how depends in part on how that human being depends on God's assistance response. Okay, but humans cannot do anything good without God's grace. So this good part, we don't do it alone. Okay, what we can do alone is to stop doing the bad. We can just omit. Okay, and then God helps us with His grace to do the good. Okay, so that's how it can be that we play a role, our free will plays a role in salvation by omitting from willing the bad. But that doesn't mean we're doing good. That would conflict with Proposition 7. Okay, but yet it's still only by grace that we do good. We can only go this way with God's grace. So that's how Rhoda responds to that objection. Yeah, so there we go. Right, we'll keep moving on.